produced in this short period of time had a big impact on the world price of oil. It reduced the world price of oil, such that not only did they blow it away in a couple of decades, but they blew it away at low prices. So it's really very hard to picture a less satisfactory policy from any long-term point of view of national interest. But that's what they did, and they did it, I'm sure, in good faith, in this undying faith in the open market, which just isn't structured to deal with the depletion of a resource. This is something that's never addressed in the past, because it hasn't happened in the past. And then you have another thing: the governments, politicians don't get there without having good noses. You know, they know what is a vote-catching, desirable kind of thing to go into, and they know what is good not to know. So to this day, you cannot find within the British government, within the Department of Trade and Industry, you cannot find any group of people actually studying depletion. They just don't do it. And so they deny themselves the information with which they could react in some sensible way, and no doubt they do it deliberately, because if they studied themselves, they would be lumbered with the results of their study, which would be hard to suppress. So they find it much better not to study the question. You could say the same for the European Union. European Union is absolutely incredibly ignorant of this subject. These are trained economists. They're not oil people. They work with public data. They do all kinds of studies and stuff, but they lack any kind of depth of knowledge into this. And in part, this relates to the International Energy Agency. I should say a few words about this. In the aftermath of the oil shocks of the 70s, Kissinger established the International Energy Agency, which has a headquarters in Paris, and it belongs to the OECD governments. I don't know exactly how many, but 20 or so governments have funded this thing, and its mandate, they set it up with a treaty, which is an excellent treaty. It was instructed to study resource constraints, look at the evolving position, be prepared for interruptions, and in those days they were pictured as deliberate short-term interruptions of a political nature, but even so their mandate was to study security of supply. They were given executive powers over strategic stocks, because at that time the Western countries felt obliged to have stocks to meet a short-term interruption of 90 days, I think. And so the IEA administers this, but the IEA itself has not studied the resource base itself. This is an obvious starting point for anybody concerned with security of supply, is to study the resource base. That seems so obvious, but they don't do it. They have denied themselves access to the industry database, which they could certainly afford. And they put out these reports every year, written in the blandest of tones. Business as usual is the great theme. They extrapolate linearly the trends of the past. But it's rather interesting that 2 years ago there was an element within the IEA who understood this situation as clearly as anyone would who had knowledge of it. And they contrived and they managed to put out a coded message, one could say. And they did this first in a report to the G8 ministers, and the text was as bland as usual. There was nothing exceptional about the text. You could skim through this and put it back in the briefcase and feel content. But within this thing was a table which showed the projection of demand out to 2020, which was going to rise at 2% a year, no, I think 1.5% a year, to 112 billion barrels. And then they showed where it was going to come from. There was a list there of conventional oil, Middle East, non-conventional, refinery gains, so on and so forth. It was shown to rise, this is the unconventional oil, meaning the tar sands of Canada and so forth, rise to 2.4 million barrels a day by 2010, and that was apparently perceived to be the limit. And it was kind of right that there should be a limit, because the problem of digging up this stuff gets exponentially more difficult. So to have a rise up to 210 and then see it flattening off sounds reasonable. And they went through all of this, and then at the bottom of the list of where it was coming from, there was an item called balancing item, described as unidentified unconventional. well, casually looking through this long list of places, nobody particularly would notice this unidentified, unconventional, well, what's that? Nobody knows. And so it passed through, and no one in the IEA's, the mandarins there presumably didn't notice this, and it got out, and then the conspirators within managed to get it into their 1998 report. But of course, it doesn't take a moment's thought to realize unidentified, considering that the identified is already enormous, and it isn't the question of identification, it is the question of extraction rate that matters. And so to have this enormous amount, and it rose from 0 in 2010 to 19 million barrels a day by 2020, this huge increase of this unidentified, mysterious substance, not explained in any sense, was a euphemism for shortage. And of course it didn't take the journalists too long to smoke this out, with a little bit of help, one must admit. At first they were quite pleased that their coded message had been decoded, because they said, we can't say it directly, but we're glad we managed to get it out in this way. But then these particular people left the organization, and they went back to their old ways, and now they were able to do so because they were able to hide under the skirts of the United States Geological Survey, who has come out with this completely flawed study, although couched in the most scientific terms, which gives abundant oil for the foreseeable future, and under this skirt the IEA was able to hide. And so in the next issue of their famous report, this mysterious but very large item had disappeared without trace or explanation or anything, to be happily taken up by non-OPEC oil or something. I forget exactly where they put it. And since I in fact contacted the Irish government not so long ago to ask them what their position was on all this, and the man said, well, you see, Ireland, we small country, we don't have any particular expertise in this oil, and we are a member of the International Energy Agency, and so we base our policies on what this organization tells us. So we see here this completely useless organization that has manifestly failed to live up to the responsibilities set for it under the treaty that established it. I mean, it's failed, and it's probably deliberately failed because the economics ministries of its owners don't really want to hear. It puts out these flawed studies, which are then taken as the gospel for the member countries. No one in Ireland could possibly be accused of having failed to address Ireland's own energy problem if he can say, well, I've based my judgment on this international organization of eminent respectability, what more could I do? So this is a happy way for the governments to evade this issue, and in political terms it's a difficult one, because it's much easier for a politician to react to a crisis or an act of God, or still better, some kind of intervention by the Arabs or something like that. That's something people can understand, that this came out of the clear blue sky, and you know, it's a crisis and we've got to react to it. But to sit in the cold light of day and anticipate a crisis, which anyone could do with a minimum of effort, that doesn't fit the political world, I'm afraid. It's one of the flaws of democracy. It doesn't like to look ahead very well. So that's the government reaction to all of this.
Is the great interest shown by the US and others in the Caspian and Iraq justified from an oil perspective?
Well, the United States discovery peaked in 1930, production peaked in 1970, and even they cannot be unaware that their own supply is inexorably falling. I mean, this is the most mature place on Earth. It's also the highest consumer, more or less, highest consumption per capita. And so the government, whereas the Clinton administration somehow denied anything to do with this and hid away from it, the Bush administration, when it came in, the Secretary of Energy did say that this was a very serious issue. The brownouts in California was kind of triggered this, and he came out with an official statement saying that America faced a very important energy crisis, that might affect the whole way of life there. This was rather